so welcome everyone to this event entitled Deglobalisation, the Future of the Liberal International Order. And to some extent, there's actually a lot of reason to celebrate now. So as an academic, you write and you write and you write. And then eventually there is an outcome to it. And we have two really wonderful outcomes that we're going to talk about today. One is this special issue in international affairs that I have in my hands that just came out with international affairs. And the other one is the Oxford Handbook on Peaceful Change, which is also out already. But thanks to new kinds of hurdles of goods making it over the channel, the English channel, I don't have it in my hands yet, but it is out, so anyone interested in it, have a look at it. I'm not going to say all that much now. TV Paul, who's joining us on the screen, I hope. TV Paul is going to tell you more about that because he, in a way, is the mastermind of that all. And that started some time ago when he founded GRENPEC, that is a global research network on peaceful change. And peaceful change is a very, very important matter in international affairs because international politics never ever stays the same. It changes over time. And that begs then the question, how come that this change can be peaceful? Because oftentimes the change is actually not peaceful, it's violent. And so he co-edited the special issue together with me. And he was also the lead editor of the Oxford Handbook. And before I'm going to hand over to him, I'm going to introduce you the panel and tell you a little bit about how things are going to shape up today. So we've invited contributors to the special issue and to the handbook. And to my very left there is Jozef Batora. He's Professor of International Relations at Webster University. Then there's Dorit, Geva, Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology from the Central European University. To my right is Erna Burai. She's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And then I have announced TV already. He's the James McGill Professor of International Relations at McGill University in Montreal. And some time ago was my professor, and actually a really great one, I may add. Let me also thank a couple of institutions, because this is a cooperation now that brings 4 institutions together: Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, Chatham House in London that publishes international affairs, Oxford University Press published the Handbook of Peaceful Change, and of course also the Austrian Research Association, because within the Austrian Research Association we also have a network on peaceful change, and 3 of us actually who sit here on the podium now, they're part of that network. So I'm going to hand over to TV Paul now. He's going to talk for about 10 minutes, give you a bit of more of a background of the projects. And then he's going to turn the word over to me. I'm basically going to be something like a moderator. And then we're going to discuss the main themes of both works, special issue and handbook. TV, the word is all yours.
Wonderful to speak to you from Montreal, where I am enjoying a nice sunny, balmy day, although it is getting a little cold here. I am missing Vienna because the past 2 years I haven't been able to visit your wonderful city and the university and the Vienna school, where I sometimes give one short course. So, as Markus said, this is a collaborative enterprise, a loose network, which actually originated from the 2017 International Studies Association convention in Baltimore. I was president at that time, on the theme of change in world politics. And we did a special issue of International Studies Review, one of the ISA's journals, some 21 chapters, and 7 chapters were on the subject of peaceful change. So while working on all those, many of us came to the conclusion that the subject of peaceful change has not been given the due attention it deserves despite the fact that our discipline originated from the debate surrounding peaceful change. As you know, the 1930s, the peace conferences that the Europeans organized, especially EHCAR and company, the League of Nations was very much involved in it. And then the question is, are we entering a new phase of power transition conflicts involving China, United States, and probably not as high with Russia, as well as the other players that are trying to get into the act. Do we have a theory on peaceful transformation occurring in the contemporary setting, or a set of theories, and how do we go about it as IR scholars? We have lots of literature on war, conflict, arms control, disarmament, whatnot. China's rise is a big deal today, but many of them focus on the subject of as Thucydides traps sort of arguments about potential conflicts coming. So that's where I think we have a niche, and many of our contributors come from some 41 chapters in this handbook. I got a copy partly because I don't know how you will see it on my screen, but how it is looking. It is a thick thing, but it is also online, Kindle, as well as Oxford. And it is an enormous amount of undertaking. I never realized I've never undertaken this big of a joint activity. It took about 2.5 years of back and forth and chapters and commissioning chapters, but to our surprise, or I wouldn't say surprise, to our happiness, we got extremely good support from collaborators. At least 3 of them are sitting on your table there. And we produced this magnum opus sort of thing. So it has some 7 substantive chapters, parts of the 41 chapters. 4 chapters historical origins. 10 chapters deal with theoretical traditions. Some 8 chapters deal with the material ideational sources of peaceful change. Then we look at some 8 pivotal states that have contributed or at least attempted peaceful change. Some 10 regions in terms of peaceful change. And so it's a substantive set of papers and articles, and they deal with a variety of subjects. And my introductory chapter deals with the issue of definitions. What is peaceful change, sort of maximalist and the minimalist position. Then we go into systemic, subsystemic understanding. So, but the key thing about there is it's comprehensive enough. You have historical discussion, and you also have the key agents of change, mechanisms of change. We look at the key states, as I mentioned, the great powers in particular. Some of them have contributed, then they have abandoned. Russia is a particular case, contributing in a big way with Gorbachev, then abandoning it today, almost abandoning it. China, the same thing, the peaceful rise strategy, and almost abandoning under Xi Jinping. So this is a very interesting dynamics. This is not to say that all changes are peaceful. Some are not peaceful, some are violent. And so the questions that we try to understand for the future research agenda is, why is that our key paradigms in international relations not paying sufficient or coherent attention to this phenomenon? We perhaps need a more eclectic rather than paradigmatic approach. What are the structural conditions and likely candidates, the relationship between peace and change, domestic political international change, emerging technologies and change, cyberspace in particular, role of social movements, state capacity issues? What kind of methods and sources we need to use to understand change? And interdisciplinary approaches, going back to the 1930s, that was interdisciplinary effort. And so why do we get peaceful cycles followed by violent cycles? So this is the key project or product so far. It's remember, the network was inaugurated only in 2019 ISA conference in Toronto. So we are very proud that we produced a lot rather quickly. And we have about 2 or 3 other projects. Colleagues in Singapore and Brisbane, Australia, are working on East Asia centered peaceful transition questions. And we have another big project on international organizations and peaceful change. My colleague from Copenhagen and Brisbane, Anders Wiewel and Kai He are co-organizing with me. But the thing that you are going to discuss more is based on, as Markus showed you, this again, a double issue of international affairs, which is Chatham House's lead journal and also one of the oldest and most prestigious journals in our field. We were quite happy to see scholars of different caliber, different backgrounds and interests contributing to the question of linking up international order, that's liberal order, with globalization / deglobalization processes taking place. So it's a variety of discussions about how deglobalization is affecting, or some don't think it's a big deglobalization, but there are many parameters of it we can witness affecting the liberal order and vice versa. So this is a two-way street in many ways. So the papers were thoroughly edited and reviewed, and Markus and I worked together very well. It's really a pleasure to see this being launched at Vienna School, and my colleagues who are contributors there will speak more. But clearly we are hopeful that we need to continue work on this, and perhaps different settings where we can also invite policymakers. And so Vienna is actually a great place for that kind of enterprise. But thank you so much for organizing it. And we are indeed happy that this is evincing much interest. Markus didn't mention the articles in this special issue are now available online. If you go to the International Affairs webpage, September issue, until November end, free downloading, which is kind of a unique thing for OUP to offer. So those of you who are interested, please download and distribute the articles or links to others who might be interested. Let me stop there. I know our speakers are going to give us more interesting ideas here. Thank you.
TV, thank you very much. So we now basically have the background and one concept that we heard about all the time, peaceful change. And so the first question I want to ask now, and I think, Erna, I'm going to ask you that big question, what actually is peaceful change?
Thank you, Markus. Thank you, TV. And let me warmly thank you all for the invitation and also for the opportunity to contribute to the Oxford Handbook on Peaceful Change. And to answer Markus's question, your question, I will say why it was so exciting to receive that invitation to contribute to this book. And coming from an international relations background, as TV mentioned, the origins of the discipline is to think about peace and how to preserve peace on different levels. And the first chair in international relations back in 1920 was supposed to study exactly that. And still the discipline, while supposedly studying peace, actually ended up looking at war most of the time, looking at conflicts, looking at wars on different levels, challenges, contestation. And so the contribution to this book actually gave us the opportunity, me and my co-author Stephanie Hoffman, to revisit what we actually know about peace, somewhere deep down under that emphasis on war. And it actually provided the opportunity to piece together what we really know about peace, what we know about the actors that can promote peace, what we can know about already the factors that contribute to peace, and what are the mechanisms in which actors can strategically, normatively move to promote certain ideas. And since we were looking at constructivism, social constructivism mostly, we were looking at how certain social conventions at place are favorable to peace or actually sustain peace.
Do institutions have to do with peaceful change? Because Jozef is definitely our expert for institutions.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to the panel, Markus, as well as, of course, to you and TV for inviting me to contribute to the special issue. It's very, very good to have done that, and I guess we'll talk about the contributions to the special issue later on. But to answer your first question about what do institutions have to do with peaceful change? Well, institutions order the world. These are mechanisms for ordering and regulating relations between entities in world affairs. And that, of course, is the foundation and the basis for peaceful relations. Without institutions, and I'm not only talking about formal institutions, such as, you don't usually think about international organizations as institutions. I'm talking about institutions in the sense of the English school, thinking about diplomacy, thinking about war, sovereignty, territoriality as such. Those are institutions of the modern state order, and they help us conceptualize interactions, structure interactions in a certain way. And that, of course, contributes to peaceful set of relations because there is predictability if institutional arrangements, norms are shared. Expectations are shared, and that's what institutions have to do with it. In a world without institutions, there is, I suppose, permanent conflict.
And in your contribution, there is a lot about institutional change. And can you very briefly summarize that argument?
Would you like me to do that right now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, the contribution I make to the special issue is about states, interstitial organizations, and adaptation and prospects for adaptation of the liberal international order. Now, the question or the idea that I'm elaborating upon is that states as such face various kinds of constraints because the liberal international order has norms and is highly institutionalized with its rules. And states face various constraints upon its actions in trying to adapt to the changing international environment because of the constraints of the liberal international order. Now, given these constraints, states are trying to find and develop new organized solutions, new organizational solutions, by developing and founding what I call interstitial organizations. That is, organizations emerging between different institutional domains. And the examples I give in the article is the European External Action Service, the diplomatic service of the European Union, as well as private military companies as interstitial organizations. They emerge, in the case of the European External Action Service, emerge in the interstices, interinstitutional domains between diplomacy, defense, intelligence, development aid. They recombine practices and norms from across these different domains and thereby generate alternative practice frames and generate innovations in various domains to which they're connected. And that's what happens with the European External Action Service. If you imagine it, this is a strange kind of an animal. And I'm sure, in many of your discussions here in this university, you will have discussed that, right? The EU is not a state, and yet it has a diplomatic service and acts as if it were a state, yet it's not one, right? And so it's an interesting kind of a situation where the EU, as such, with this diplomatic service, and it does things that states normally cannot do and will not do. And that is, of course, an example of that would be transformational practices in societies on the EU's perimeter. That's not what the diplomatic service is normally supposed to do, because you're not supposed to get involved, and you have all read your Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. You're not supposed to get involved in the internal affairs of states. Yet the EU, as a norm, does that all the time. So this, and it can do that because it's not a state. It can also do things that, if you remember now, a couple of weeks ago, when all the member states of the European Union have left Kabul, shut down their embassies, the only embassy, as it were, that's stuck around is the EU delegation. And why? And this is the official explanation too, given by Joseph Borrell. We are not a state, so we can stick around. We can still have our own relations with the, with the Taliban, and do things that states cannot do. So in a way, the interstitial organizations, that's the argument in the paper, can do things that both strengthen the liberal international order, such as what Emanuel Adler would call liberal international practices, and that has to do with the EU's practices of promoting liberal governance in its surroundings, and or undermine the liberal international order at the same time, because they undermine the very centrality of the state in the order. And of course, the core institutions of the modern state, of the liberal international order, are state-centric. There's an entire section on private military companies, which of course also are interstitial organizations between the private sector, the military, intelligence, and of course diplomacy, and a number of other domains. Again, they recombine norms and practices from across these different domains, and you get wars without no declarations of wars, right? I mean, look at Ukraine, look at Syria, look at Libya. These are conflicts without no declared wars, yet there's warfare, right? Conducted by private companies for profit. And so again, here we, in that sphere, we're getting a transformation through alternative practice frames enacted and conducted by interstitial organizations, in this case, private military companies. And I'm happy to speak in the Q&A session about various very specific examples if you're interested in this. So in principle, the argument that I make in the paper is that there are endogenous sources of transformation in the international order, international liberal order. And those have to do with the attempts of states to maintain their capacity to act despite the constraints that are, or given the constraints that are there in the liberal international order. And they do so by generating and creating these kinds of interstitial organizational structures.
Thank you, Jozef, for a very concise summary of a quite complicated but really excellent argument. Dorit, probably one of the sources of a changing international order is that people have new ideas about it. And to some extent, that's what you actually wrote about. So you wrote about a vision for the international order and how this vision is pushed. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my article, which I should emphasize is a co-authorship with Felipe Santos, who was a postdoc now in London. It's about the emergence of far-right higher educational projects in Europe. And we focus in particular on next door, on a major university that was founded in Hungary by Viktor Orban in 2012. And we look at that university and also an institution that was founded by Marion Maréchal. So this is the niece of Marine Le Pen in France. She used to carry the Le Pen family name, but dropped it. So she just goes now by Marion Maréchal. And she's a very formidable younger figure in the French far right. And she has founded in the city of Lyon, which is within France, a traditionally conservative stronghold. I think there's a bit of a sound. Okay, I hope it's okay. She is founded in France, in Lyon, and then also with a new partnership in Spain, an institution called ISEP, which is her own attempt at trying to create a far-right institution of higher education with the ambitions to be something like this university in Hungary, which is the national, in Hungary, it's called NUPS Ludovica, which stands for the National University of Public Service, and is essentially trying to be like this institution with the full force of the state behind it. And ESEP in France, on the other hand, is a much more fledgling institution. It doesn't have the full force of the state behind it. It doesn't have the same degree of accreditation. But we look at these projects to try to understand what is the ambition, the intellectual ambition, the political ambition, and the economic ambition that is emerging from these universities. And we claim that what we can see emerging is what we call globalist illiberalism. So let me try to give a very brief account of that. So we're inspired by the work of an intellectual historian called Quinn Slobodian, whose book Globalists I highly recommend. It's an intellectual history of the architects of what some might call the liberal international order, what others might call the global neoliberal order. Slobodian falls into the latter camp. And he follows the trajectory. The story begins here in Vienna. I mean, not here, but in Vienna, of figures like Hayek and von Mies, whom he claimed developed what he calls a globalist vision of the world order. So this was a really utopian fantasy following the end of the Habsburg Empire of trying to recapture and trying to recreate a political economic space which is borderless, so essentially creating a new world order that is based on the kind of fantasy and nostalgia of the Habsburg Empire as a borderless zone of trade, of free trade. And these intellectuals do the unthinkable, and they actually, according to him, essentially managed to transform the world order in the 20th century through a slow but persistent intellectual project. So it's as much a political project as it is an intellectual project, because it's also seated in universities. It crosses the pond. It has a transatlantic dimension, of course, because it crosses the pond to the United States, enters into very prominent schools of economics and international relations, and also becomes the foundation, in his view, of the Washington Consensus. So we argue that there are some parallels in terms of the ambitions, and that there's an attempt to take parts of this globalist vision in accepting, so on the part of figures like Marion Maréchal and also Viktor Orban, and what we see in these universities, which is to accept the premise of a world order that promotes free trade. So a commitment to free trade. And in that sense, these are not anti-globalist actors. But on the other hand, to imbue it with a strongly nationalist flavor. According to Slobodian's book, the foundational globalists were very anti-nationalist, because nationalism builds borders. Borders is bad for free trade in the globalist view. So the twist here in what we call the globalist liberals, in this milieu of intellectuals, it's basically organic intellectuals of this new right-wing vision, is to be pro-capitalist, pro-free trade, but deeply nationalist, and also at the same time to resist the liberal cultural values that went hand in hand with the liberal international order. So together we say this forms what we call a globalist illiberal ideology by looking at these two particular institutions and the corpus of intellectuals and work that is associated with them. And that the ambition is very much an ambition of change. The target is, I mean, there's a lot of focus on transforming the European Union from within. The National University of Public Service in Hungary is an interesting example, because it's very clearly, it has a new tuition-free, so a free program called Europe of Nations. So it's in reference to Jean Monnet. And so it's claiming that what it's doing is preparing young people for public administration in the European Union, to do entrance examinations, for example, in the EU bureaucracy. but to imbue them simultaneously with both your EU values, but also the love of the nation. And I think, I mean, I cannot say with certainty that this institution is an inspiration, but I am guessing that it is very much a model for what NUPS is trying to be, and to really try to create a cadre, not just of intellectuals, but also actors, agents of change, who will enter into international institutions and try to transform them from within.
Thanks a lot. There was one major theme in there about the special issue. That's on the one hand, there are all kinds of globalizing dynamics continuing. And on the other hand, there are deglobalizing dynamics kicking in. So this is something that across various, very different contributions and the special issue comes up over and over again. So for instance, the way how political communities are imagined, that narrows down again. So focus is very much again on the nation state, so the Europe of nations. Whereas other things, if you think about, so we wrote a paper on global health. If you think about certain coronaviruses, they're very, very much global. Yeah, so it's this globalization, deglobalization goes very much hand in hand. TV, you had another concept in there. In your conclusion, there was deglobalization. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that means?
Well, I link it up to the three mechanisms, the Kantian tripod, as we know, institutions, economic interdependence, and democracy are three pillars of the liberal order. And they are also very much part of this new round of globalization that took place after the end of the Cold War and in the 1990s onwards. And so all the three are under stress today. Stress because the elements that produced certain externalities that came out of globalization process generated extraordinary inequalities in liberal societies in particular, of course, and all other societies that benefited China, India, etc. But the point is that the liberal societies are very vulnerable to these challenges. And so I argue that it's time to think about reforming the liberal order. The paper, the discussion you just had about these forces trying to attack it. But the point is that liberal order is perhaps the most successful order in terms of adapting. Of course, a bloody one for the past 200 years, violent adaptation. But the point is it adapted much better than alternate systems like communism or fascism for that matter. So the point is that if liberal order has to survive this existential crisis it's facing today, the democratic backsliding that was discussed just now, institutional malaise, economic interdependence going in a very skewed way, some benefiting, others not. And of course, the geopolitical challenge coming from the authoritarian China, which benefited tremendously from globalization. So the success of the globalization in creating new power centers also contributing to its demise, or not demise, its backlashes that we're witnessing. So I argue that we need to think about, there is no way to escape from globalization. Globalization is here to stay because people benefit from it, especially the larger stakeholders, and the beneficiaries are many. Technological globalization is very pivotal for our advancement. But globalization can generate internal fissures, especially in the United States, we're witnessing today. You have different class conflicts going on, partly because the state abandoned, weak policies were adopted. State abandoned the people who are not benefiting from globalization. So what are the ways to adapt as liberal predecessors did? In the 1919, the Wilsonian, of course, it has a lot of other problems. Adaptation, 1930s onwards, the Roosevelt adaptation, 1960s, the Johnson era adaptation, 1990s, of course, some level of Clinton's period too. But the point is that without a rethinking of the past 100, 200 years of liberal transformation and its coexistence or contribution to the globalizing process, we will not get to understand what is happening today. These are all interlinked and they're very connected to class divisions that are coming out in different societies as a result of this globalization and potentially deglobalization processes.
Thanks a lot. And with that, we're going to move towards a freer discussion, so involving you as well, also involving the panelists if they want to add something. And I think Erna was the first one who wanted to add something.
Yes. Thank you, Markus. Yes, I think all your fascinating contributions to the special issue and now the discussion also shows that there are two main factors that we need to look at when we study peaceful change. One is the ideational content that comes in the form of identities or norms or culture. And the other one is institutions. So peaceful change doesn't come from nowhere. It is always anchored in these institutional forms, spaces, and it's also coming as a result of this very strategic, incremental, gradual, very conscious building of that culture, norm, and identity that Dorit has been describing, for instance. And this is the contribution of constructivism. They have introduced a lot, back in the 90s, they have introduced much of these concepts of norms, cultures, but also certain institutional forms such as bureaucracy or epistemic communities. And I think it's fascinating to see how it is happening, the two together, how it is anchored and how you can identify those agents who are putting all the resources, who are developing ideas through particular institutional channels.
Microphone now, it's fine again. I know that you are a lively crowd, so I'm gonna bundle always questions of 3. Who wants to go?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Pega Roshmai, and I just wanted to, regarding the whole topic, peaceful change, ask whether I wondered whether nonviolent movements are known to be more effective than than armed struggles in achieving a change.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Who wants to go next? Yes.
So thank you very much. My name is Alexander Ehrer, and did want to ask about the obvious elephant in the room, China, because we did talk about constructivism, normative change, and therefore my question was how you would evaluate this new impact from the East on the liberal world order and how globalization or deglobalization could look like. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ariane Fatni. I'm my student, and I think my question goes directly to Mr. Batora, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So we spoke about interstitial institutions and that you conceptualize them based on the English school conceptualization. So my question would be whether we could consider the responsibility to protect as another such interstitial institution created by states, given the structural constraints of the liberal international order that is actually challenging or at least changing the notion of and the norm of national sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. And the first question of non-violence, anyone can go for it. I mean, I can say one was over there. This, you know, in international relations until quite recently, there was almost dismissed, yeah, so that non-violence causes non-violence, or that violence would cause violence. So violence at a prior moment in time, then more violence thereafter. But now there's actually quite a bit of quantitative research that provides quite some evidence for it.
Actually, I can say a bit if you feel
Yeah.
like. There is actually a very impressive book by Chenoweth, and forget the co-author's name. Quantitative and qualitative study on the number of cases and showing that, in fact, nonviolent resistance has done more for peaceful change, more change than violent change, violent conflicts. I think this is a fascinating area. In fact, just look at the end of the Cold War onwards, the transformations that took place in Eastern Europe and many other democratic revolutions, many of them were peaceful. And what's happening in the whole US, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, the whole series of things that it's hard to measure the impact. But the point is that they are all peaceful transformations in many sense. I must warn you, though, that not all peaceful change is good change. Sometimes through peaceful mechanisms, anti-democratic forces, as Geva was talking about in the some of these, the anti-democratic forces can use peaceful mechanisms to gain power and then transform it into their vision. So even though we all like peaceful change and peace, it doesn't mean that it's inevitably for the good. I mean, you just mentioned the China question, which is obviously China's rise is much more peaceful than previous European rising powers. And we all hope that it will end up in a peaceful situation of coexistence rather than one seeking hegemony over the other or replacing the liberal order, as sometimes you get that impression from Chinese spokesperson. So that's that question that is very relevant, whether the Chinese rise will be peaceful. I mean, we can always hope for, but the point is there are some benefits that came out of globalization that China made use very well. Now the question is, can China provide that kind of a leadership role and create a system whereby others can coexist with it? Actually, there is a fantastic paper in this issue by John Owen on the emergence of two types of systems emerging, one led by the US, one led by China, which is worth reading in terms of they could potentially coexist because they are a lot more interdependent than the previous Soviet versus American-led clubs or blocks.
Thanks, TV. Is then the R2P that was directly addressed to you, Jozef?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very sharp observation that you're making there in terms of the R2P as a sort of a generator of interstitial change. Why? Because R2P, responsibility to protect, generates a need for action under conditions of constraints of state-centric rules, where of course there are a lot of legal constraints on state action, both in the UN system as such, but also in the diplomatic system in terms of respecting sovereignty and so on. So what happens, I think, is there are two things which are what it generates. You need to ask, how do you protect? Because there's a responsibility, but then how do you protect? And two, what does it mean to protect, right? Because I mean, and that of course can give you some interesting examples as to how states then use interstitial organizations, such as, for instance, private military companies, to provide protection of individuals in light of the constraints on state action. So, for instance, there's a great article by Chris Kinsey and one of his colleagues from King's College, who studied how the Nigerian government had used and contracted a private military company called STTEP, based out of Gibraltar, formerly out of South Africa, and they deployed into Nigeria basically to fight Boko Haram and help the Nigerian forces in that fight. Now, could they have somehow used, state ally in this case? Could they have relied on a state ally? There would have been many constraints in that direction. It would have taken much longer time to actually have your forces deployed. Here you contract a private firm who provide you with troops, and that, and that's a very effective way. Now, of course, that's one of very few examples where private military companies actually have done some had some positive effects. In most cases, this is a deeply problematic actor with various kinds of violence, various kinds of violations of human rights associated, you name it. There are so many breaches of human rights in the deployments of private military companies. I mean, there's a whole literature on this. So there's a lot of need to regulate that. That's just a footnote. The second thing is, what does it mean to protect? Because that also is, of course, generated as a question. There you have an example of the European External Action Service conducting the first air raid of the European Union on African soil. I don't know if you're aware of that, but in 2012, the European Union, in fact, off the coast of Horn of Africa, they have deployed fighter planes, helicopters out of helicopter gunships to bomb a pirate lair on the coast of Somalia. This operation was conducted by the External Action Service out of its headquarters in Brussels. There's a satellite center, there's a situational awareness center, information, and the entire operation was guided from there using resources that were under the command of the External Action Service. After the operation, you would get diplomatic employees of the External Action Service and development aid employees within that same service deploying on the scene, talking to the locals in terms of and trying to explain how life can be without piracy and what can be done, and how the European Union is going to protect their own livelihoods if they decide to live without piracy, right? So there you have an actor which is interstitial in the sense of combining multiple domains under the same roof of that same organization. In the sense of, or with the purpose of actually providing some protection to individuals. So again, I think you're absolutely right. What R2P generates is a generator of the need for interstitial kinds of structures to emerge. Yes.
Thank you, Jozef. Anyone else wants to add? Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking of this excellent question, whether armed struggle pays off better than peaceful change. And in that context, I'm really glad that the responsibility to protect was raised, because the R2P idea originated from on the African continent in the form of sovereignty should include responsibility towards, like, a state is responsible for its own population. And this is an idea that came from a Sudanese diplomat who has become the first special representative of the UN for internally displaced people. And he also drove, as a Norm entrepreneur, much of the thinking that went into rethinking African security after the Cold War. And I think that context is providing one answer to that question. And they were saying that violence always comes from marginalization to the point where that particular community within the state feels that it cannot address its grievances in a peaceful or through institutional channels. And they have seen that always more destructive. So armed struggles, conflict has its own political economy, it has its own equilibria, just like peaceful change, but it is always destroying more on the side. And at least then and there, African Norm entrepreneurs thought that peaceful change is always better. And this is how the entire ideational construct of sovereignty as responsibility and the regional African collective security was built on promoting peaceful change within the state and then on the regional level, and now projected also to the global level.
Thank you.
Oh, if I can also,
yes,
I wanted to, I really appreciated also TV's comment about, or the caveat about that not all peaceful change is necessarily a positive change. So I spoke of Hungary, and I'll speak of it again. I mean, Hungary interests me quite a bit, not just because I lived there, not just because I was at Central European University, which was kicked out, but actually because I think it's a very interesting country to analyze in terms of the transformation of the state and the transformation of power. And Viktor Orban is being actually, I think, a very innovative thinker on that front. And what's interesting to note, among other things about Hungary, is that Orban and the Fidesz party, his political party, the path towards authoritarian accumulation of power was effected through marketization. It was not effected through militarization or violence. So, and that's why I think, and it's, I think, a really innovative path towards one new innovative path towards authoritarianism, and which I think is also a model, explicitly a model unto others. And this is exactly an example of peaceful change, but towards what? Maybe in the view of some, not to a good end.
Thanks, Dorit. Then I think we're ready to move on to question block number 2. So whoever wants to ask questions, raise your hand.
My name is Alberta Kwe. Thank you very much for your presentation and your comments so far. My question is based on some events. Number 1 is the US-led troops withdrawal from the Middle East region. Number 2 event is that now coup d'etats are becoming attractive in some parts of Africa and Asia. And the third event is that now it's obvious that the relationship between the EU and the US is now fragile. So does it suggest that, do these events suggest that the protectors of the liberal international order are undermining their role? And that is why the illiberal international order is rising. And it means that it's their own doing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. There's a lot in this issue about that, and we're gonna get to.
Hello, my name is Enzio Kloss. Nice to meet you. I was thinking about when we talk about the new liberal order, deglobalization. How do you include climate change in that concept? Or how does, it's obviously a global challenge, and we see a lot of deglobalization happening on a state basis. I was just wondering, because it wasn't dealt with in the discussion, so I was just thinking if you have some ideas or visions about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my name is Benedikt Stolberg. I'm my student as well. My question is, so you certainly heard about the establishment of the new research institute by the AfD in Germany. And I wanted to ask if you would situate this institute in a similar context as the 2 universities in Hungary and in France. And also if you would count their work, which is focused on educational change of the educational system, also in this context of negative peaceful change, because it's also a peaceful change approach, in my opinion. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, no, thanks. Also a very good question. So first question was basically about agency. So who upholds liberal order, who fights it? Who wants to get the question? TV, you may be very well suited for it.
Yeah, I can give it a very quick start. I think that's exactly the challenge my concluding paper tried to address to some extent. The biggest challenge to the liberal order is not coming from non-liberal states per se, except maybe China and Russia a little bit, but from within. The liberal states are not unified actors as they used to be, because they used to have a common enemy and they needed to unite themselves to address that common enemy during the Cold War. And the neoliberalism probably undermined liberal order more than anything else, if you look at its impact on wealth distribution internally. It generated a lot of billionaires, as it's happening very frequently, but wealth distribution is not something neoliberals are interested. So, but my contention is liberalism has many strands in it. There is a socialist version, Fabian socialist, European versions to it. So that's the adaptation part of liberalism. It depends on which coalitions gain ascendancy in different parts of the world, especially in the United States, where they can implement those reforms. So Biden and his progressives are trying to implement some, but they're not very successful. If they're not successful, the onslaught will continue because the income inequalities are so prominent in many of these places. So the liberals themselves are not promoters of democracy. If you look at the way that the populists within these liberal states, and the US is in particular, Donald Trump is an exceptionally anti-democratic force, or his movement. He's not using he's using democracy, but for his personal and group interests. So a victory of that sort, again, can happen in the US in the next elections, congressional elections in November 22, we may see a Republican-dominated government and then undermining Biden further. So the polarizations are deeply occurring in these countries, and that's largely because of their inability to come up with concrete solutions to the challenges generated by deepened globalization. Climate change is a fascinating topic. Once again, it shows that neoliberals don't have an answer to these collective action problems. They may generate a lot of wealth through expropriation of natural resources or other forms of other forms of exploitation of resources without taking into account their cumulative effect on the planet. And that's also where the liberals could take the leadership role, because they do have ideas, but they will have to undercut some of those neoliberal instincts of extracting more oil, more gas, more everything for consumption purposes. So we have a very peculiar dynamics going on. And I think the neoliberal failure is not apparent in wealth creation of some countries or the powerful stakeholders, but it is definitely failing in many other arenas, including climate change. Fundamentally different conceptions and institutions are required to face that challenge.
Thank you, TV. Does anyone want to add something on the question of agency, liberal, illiberal, or on the question of climate change? Just looking around. Erna, isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
It's just the thought that I think these are excellent questions, and to zoom out a little bit again on theoretical questions, I think this shows the role of hypocrisy in politics, and especially when we still debate whether politics is only strategic, it's only realpolitik, ideas don't matter, or they can be brushed aside. I think these cases that you have mentioned in your question actually show that if you use your moral capital at one point, it's gonna fire back, and that's a relevant discussion that has been elicited in Richard Price's edited volume, Moral Limit and Possibility in Politics, that actually these questions of ethics play an important role in sustaining liberal international order, where the liberal agents themselves come into self-contradiction in sustaining those values that they ask others to uphold.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. Jozef.
I'll just add very briefly to the first question about the transformation or the rise of the illiberal international order. TV mentioned the Kantian tripod as the basis of the liberal international order, that is the global markets, liberal democracy / human rights, and international institutions, international organizations as you know, the three corners of the tripod. Now it seems that as Alexander Cooley and Dan Nexon point out in a recent article in Foreign Affairs, there's a tilting of the liberal international order in recent years towards a global acceptance of global market. Everybody, all the powers across the world, maybe with some small exceptions, such as North Korea, accept capitalism as the foundation of their actorness. However, there are very few powers remaining that still accept the entire tripod. So certainly China and Russia today do not embrace the ideas of liberal democracy and human rights protection the way it's understood traditionally, as well as, of course, they also undermine international institutions. So this tilting is a problem because, of course, you can then use market forces for various kinds of endogenous processes within the international liberal order, which of course make it undermine that very order. So your point is well taken. It's absolutely right, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you, Jozef. And I think the third question was undoubtedly one for you.
Sure. It's a very interesting example. Thank you for raising it. And I think the example of the AfD is precisely another articulation of this project that is where I think we'll see mushrooming all over. Orban is the inspiration, but I think also Marion Maréchal is an inspiration onto others. They can see that this is happening and it's starting to happen elsewhere. I don't have a sense in detail of the AfD institution and also the extent to which the ambition is really to be a full-fledged university. But I find it interesting that we've moved from a moment where there was the production of think tanks now to the production of institutions of higher education, the institutionalization of new higher education institutions in Europe. And I think this articulates another moment and actually a bigger ambition, which is, yes, I mean, which is perhaps not having, I don't know how many of these actors directly read Gramsci, but I think there is really, at least some cite Gramsci and are aware of politics as a hegemonic project and very much see educational projects in the production of ideas and even use concepts explicitly like organic intellectuals as part of their political project. And we see now that in Germany, the latest articulation of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorit. And I think we can move on to yet another set of questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I would like to, my name is Cameron Dourov, MICE 2. I would like to add to the question of my colleague, Benedict. As a student of Diplomatic University, for me, it's quite interesting to know. It seems that Hungary is leading the eventual second bloc within the bloc. And as we know, there's quasi Collège de l'Europe in Belgium, which is one of the leading universities for propaganding kind of the Europeanism, to give the European values. Do you think that the far right higher education, which is accredited already and financed fully from Budapest, do you think that we might have Collège de Populisme? Like, I'm speculating now, but do you think that Hungary might be the center of the higher education for propaganding populism?
Thank you. Yes. Nesina, now you have to run the other. Yes. Good.
My name is Jana Krastina, and I have a very general question, and namely, what are, in your opinion, best opportunities for changing peacefully and positively the existing liberal order that currently exists and should be taken, in your opinion, into account by decision makers? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Andriana, and I think that this question would be for you, Professor Batora. So given that we are witnessing the stalemate that the international community is facing when it comes to tackling and addressing issues such as and concerning cyberspace or lethal autonomous weapon systems or environment, do you think that there would be a trend towards regionalization, and should it be supported by the UN system, given the UN and the principles of the UN Charter, as a complementary trend to globalization? Or do you think that the regional approach to tackling global issues would lead to more fragmentation? Thank you.
Thank you. The first question, Collège de what would that be in French? Populisme. I'm going to hand over to Dorit.
I think that is the ambition. Thank you for the great title. I think Orban will thank you for it. Yes, I actually think that's the ambition. I mean, I think the ambition is serious and it's ambitious, and it has. I mean, it has the full force of the state behind it. It has the funding. This was actually a very early step that Viktor Orban took after he was reelected in 2010 to reassess education in public administration in Hungary, and within 2 years of his reelection, founded this new university. My own view is that the Central European University story is actually a footnote to what is really the NUP story, to be the dominant university in Hungary. But that's, you know, that's just my hypothesis. I think it's possible, and we see that Budapest is becoming the kind of Rome of this political ideology. I mean, there was just there's now an annual demography conference, which sounds very technocratic and, you know, sort of statistical on paper, but it's actually become, every year it increasingly, it's become the homecoming of the European populist radical right, with increasingly American actors who appear, because, and it's very interesting to me that it's a combination of what sounds like a very boring academic discipline, which is demography, but actually is an engine for, you know, for basically nationalist, populist ideology to propagate and also to share ideas. And Marion Maréchal and also now Éric Zemmour, who's this new, well, he's not new, but he's become more prominent figure in the French far right. It's like you know, they paid homage. They showed up at the conference. So I think, yes, in some, Collège de Populisme is growing institutionally in Europe.
Then we have the kind of diametrically opposed question, something like prospects for peaceful change, and what role the European Union could play in that as an actor.
Thanks for that. I'll, if I may add a footnote to this question on the Collège de Populisme, I would actually say that Orban would never call it a Collège de Populisme. He would call it the Collège of Europe. Use the same term, but he understands it in a different way, right?
Or patriotism.
And because he has this very strange, and this is an observation of me not studying Orban, just reading newspapers, but I mean, he has a very strange view of what it means to be pro-European. There's a very strange political geography in the arguments he uses, right? Because he's pro-European, defending Europe against mainstream Western Europe. How do you reconcile that? That's very strange, right? So so he would probably be doing that, but that's just a footnote to that. To your question, I think that's a great. It's a great challenge, I would say, for the European Union to effectively enact regulation. If there's anything the European Union can do, it is regulation. It is a regulatory giant. In military terms, the EU is a dwarf. There's no doubt about it. But in terms of regulation, the EU can actually make a difference. And we have seen that in numerous battles of the European Union with major corporations, where, you know, Apple and others have had to, you know, reconcile with the European Union and follow the standards set by the EU. So on Facebook, look at them, right? I mean, they're being pushed into a role here, and so I think what you're proposing is, of course, a good idea. Now the question is, do other regions have the same capacity for regulation and enactment of those regulations as the EU? I don't see that at this stage. That's number one. Number two, the EU is very strong in its regulation as long as it, you know, plays together with the United States very often in terms of global standards. So I think, and that doesn't always happen either. So it's always a challenge. If they ever were to play together, then the standards are for real, and then they're global. So I think, but I think this is a good question, but more broadly in terms of what's happening in Europe, because there's no doubt that the European Union is a regional cosmopolitan vanguard of whatever we might term a global order. Now, do other regions follow? I don't know, but there are already signs of structural copying of the EU model, and the EU even tries to promote its own model beyond its borders. So think about ASEAN, for instance, having structures which are very similar to the European Union, the African Union, Mercosur. So there are regional groupings which sort of follow in similar steps, although of course these are very different contexts, very different stages of development and so on. You can't say this is, you know, they're able to copy the EU experience. But I'm sure that the EU is certainly, you know, as I said, a regional vanguard of regional cosmopolitan vanguard of the global order. Yeah.
TV, do you want to come?
I could add something on the first question, which I thought was a broader question about what should we do. I think crises often offer opportunities for adaptation and change. And we are in such a crisis mode. And the problem, though, liberals cannot use their typical mechanisms. Number one is, I mean, you talked about R2P a little bit, but the whole problem of liberal interventions, you look at the damage that has done to world order, and Middle East is a great example. The American military interventions were not often driven by liberal ideas, but of course, somewhat motivated by that goal, but almost all of them failed because they were using this extraordinary force for achieving societal transformations, sometimes for geopolitical purposes, pretending to be liberal goals. And so it's time to stop those bloody interventions unless you have a proper exit plan, unless it is supported by international institutions, legitimate interventions, of course, human rights apart. But the point is that it's a time to stop that. And will the US and others stop that? I don't know. It's very hard to say. Now, the big point that we missed is this propaganda war going on in the social media today, and the effect that has on the generations that are coming up. The social media is both good and bad, as we know. But the liberal opinion makers are not winning this battle. We don't have a Fukuyama moment of end of history in terms of liberals are facing more challenges because the other side has instruments to play with. And propaganda is an area where the liberals are weakened because lies can be spread through the social media so easily, and people tend to believe that. So we need better liberal opinion makers, better propaganda, and better record, and a learning from mistakes, and a willingness to live together, realizing that perhaps there will be a Chinese-led order. You can't say that liberals have to win all the time. Liberals may have to coexist with that. Of course, it won't be that friendly, but it could be adversarial, but it could be a very different kind of relationship. And that's a very tricky part of engagement with the system that is now coming up in the Eastern world. So I don't know, the liberals have to give up some of this condescending attitude toward other approaches towards world orders. And that includes the European project. I think they need to think of ways to coexist. And if you can do that, perhaps liberal ideas will get a lot more attention, and avoid militant liberalism to some extent. This extraordinary tendency to use force for goals that are not often liberal.
Thank you, TV.
Yes, a quick reflection, but I think Dorit knows much more about this, that liberal interventions is a very, very important example, but also the authoritarian backlash in Central and Eastern Europe is actually somehow come out of a particular historical experience of implementing liberal ideas, and that society going through that, and some successes and failures and a lot of pain. So we need to be critical, as TV said, also about, you know, how societies actually encounter liberal ideas, how they live through it as a lived experience. And if I may react to the question on regionalism, because I find it really fascinating. So especially because in Geneva with our principal investigator, Stephanie Hoffman, we study regions in a project that is titled Global Norm Ambiguity and Regional Orders. And we look at relatively less studied regions, the African continent, Latin America, the Americas together, and the post-Soviet space, which actually shows how different these regions are from the European Union. Which is not a very new thing to say, but it's sometimes interesting to see how much they diverse. And I think they also show that when we think of change, it's never linear. So we are not rushing towards one endpoint, but it's always more like a wrestling, like a contestation. There is always forces, pull and push, rather than imagining it on a linear track. And you asked about fragmentation, if regions take over. So we look at, I can give you an example on security and how these regions built up their security orders, security institutions after the Cold War. And some of them are very skeptical of integrating that system into the global, the UN order or UN institutions, but some, such as the African Union, very much, and this is the contribution of Katarina Coleman and Brian Job in the International Affairs journal also, they very much want to be connected to that UN system. They are asking for finance, they ask for a certain division of labor, whereas the post-Soviet space would be very much Russia keeping everyone out of its own sphere. So I think it's hard to say whether it's either fragmentation or it's either deglobalization or globalization. I think it's very interesting to look at these push and pull contestation mechanisms, which vary by region.
Yeah, and thanks a lot. May just add something about the regionalization too. Yeah, it's really is a matter of how you look at it. There's a lot of diversity. So so if you look at Europe and you look at the acquis and you look at all the rules that there are, they actually look very liberal. And they look very progressive. It's just implementing them is no longer that easy, right? And so we know all kinds of contestations happening now about Poland, for example. So there are definitely problems on that level too. But Africa is very similar. So the constitutive act of the African Union is very, very far-reaching. So before when we talked about the responsibility to protect, that's actually written into the constitutive act, yeah. So that is a notch more, if one wants to put it like that, than say in the United Nations system. It's just that the problems with the application, and at the same time, there are certain norms that have been taken for granted in Africa for a very, very long time. So for instance, the borders are sacrosanct. And it seems to come under pressure, yeah, so especially in the Horn of Africa. So there's quite a bit of contestation between liberal, illiberal, globalizing, deglobalizing forces in regional settings, I think, as well. Shall we do one last round? Yes. Huh? Who wants to ask more questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Nurhan Deeb. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Actually, my question is inspired by what we just discussed, regionalism and the basically the diversification, the variation of certain communities, especially in Africa, and especially in times of post-conflict, which is where peaceful change and the order of the liberal international order needs to be applied. And my question technically stands on what can we attribute to communities of the region, as in what can we attribute to grassroots mechanisms such as truth-seeking investigations, victim-centric tribunals, and centrally investigations that can promote and strengthen the authority of institutional powers. And what does this stand in terms of mechanisms such as amnesties and etc.? Thank you.
Thank you all very much for sharing your
work and insights. My question is going back to what we just discussed, but also the question about the European Union and how in the word of renewing great power competition, in the word of, on one hand, calling for unification, on the other one, providing these points where the breaks might appear. How do you think the role or the shape of the current diplomacy of the EU and also the foreign policy might be changing? And that is also in the light of what we just said, that EU might be great at regulations, but getting to these regulations might be a little bit more tricky. So what kind of process might be happening for these decisions to be reached more easily, if you think that will be the way to go for the EU? Thank you.
Thank you. And then last chance to ask a question, if anyone still wants to go for it. Yes.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for this interesting insight. My question is actually a very simple one. What do you think? Do women play a particular role? Do they, or do they potentially play a particular role in peaceful change? Thank you.
Thank you. So then the first question was about communities, and I think Nurhan, I think you had something about truth and reconciliation in mind, amongst other things. Who wants to go for it? I mean, I can start. So my handbook chapter is basically so it's on African conceptions of peace and peaceful change. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or this idea of truth and reconciliation, is something that probably originated in Latin America and then made its way from Chile via South Africa to other places. So that is one way of trying to bring a community together again. In the handbook chapter, I discuss lots of them because there are quite a few of them. Another concept, perhaps that I can throw in here is Ubuntu diplomacy. Yeah, so less individualistic, more communal. Fits your question very well too. It's something that with another name, with its Shona name, made a difference in Rhodesia and the transition when it became Zimbabwe. And then from there, made its way to other places as well. There are also grassroots notions of a democracy, is palaver democracy. It doesn't sound very nice. It's what the Portuguese called, so palaver is similar to chat in Portuguese. But it's basically so village decisions being made under a big palaver tree. And so there's definitely a grassroots movement there as well. The question, of course, is then always to what extent this can be used, enacted in real politics, because there are obviously states as well, some stronger, some weaker. There are regional organizations, and there's the African Union. So, but there are definitely a lot of very, very interesting alternative ideas for how to do politics. Then diplomacy of the European Union changing.
Obviously, this is we are living in a time which is pretty exciting in exactly along the lines that you're raising. You know, where is European Union going in terms of its actorness internationally? And so there are at least three scenarios that we can see in front of us, and we don't know where this will go. But I mean, two of them are state-centric. One of them remains, keeps the EU as a kind of a non-state entity. So the first one is the Macron scenario, right? Emmanuel Macron calls for sovereign, more or less federal Europe, right? This is an EU superstate emerging. That's the idea in a very simplified term. The other idea is the Orban idea, which is the Orban vision, which is a fragmented Europe of nation states held together by very weak institutions. Again, a state-centric vision. And the third one, of course, would be the Merkel situation, I'd call it, which might be followed up upon by Scholz as the new Chancellor of Germany. which is sort of building bridges across different division lines in Europe, and also keeping the EU from actually becoming a federal state. And that's, from the analytical point of view, from an academic point of view, the most exciting kind of a vision, because the state-centric vision is boring and dangerous. Why is it boring? If the EU becomes another superstate, it's nothing new. It's just another superstate emerging, but it's dangerous at the same time, because of course we know what happens when new states emerge. We know that from the Italian experience, we know that from the German experience in the 19th century, 20th century, right? And so the EU becoming a superstate is full of dangers. We don't even talk about that backtracking towards the Europe of nation states that Orban is thinking about. So the most exciting thing from an academic point of view, but actually from the political point of view as well, is the EU as an entity which remains short of stateness, of statehood, partial state, as it were. And that allows it flexibility. It opens up various kinds of ways of conducting its external affairs. It is connected with the challenges you raise, right? How do you achieve unity? How do you achieve actorness, in fact? And there are, of course, institutional ways of trying to do that. These are all these debates about qualified majority voting in EU foreign policy. It's not there yet. Every member state has a veto, but I mean, might be happening sometimes. But it's actually pretty exciting, because I think this is the most peaceful way forward. Because after all, even without being a state, the EU has achieved the greatest transformation of states in Europe in history. We have not seen 70 or 80 years of peace in Europe throughout history. I think this is totally unique. So I think, and it has to do a lot to do with the imperfect nature and in fact ambiguous nature of the European Union as a political entity that might be the source of its attractiveness. So I think that's where we stand. So I think when we talk about the ability of the EU to become a state, we should be careful what we wish for, because I think that could be very, very dangerous and boring.
Thank you. And then there was a last question. What do women have to do with peaceful change? Whoever wants to go for it. Erna's nodding. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. It made me think of two things. One is actually, first, to start with, it's important to avoid essentializations. Women participate in conflict, men participate in making peace. There's nothing inherent in women, choosing peace or over war. But it is true that in certain regions, that in Western Africa, for instance, or the African Union, Markus will correct me or add to that, but there is a female network for women who are working for peace, and there is a recognition that women need to be involved, need to be given more decision making over peace processes. So this is when we actually talk about women being involved in peacemaking or post-conflict reconstruction. But I think it's another aspect in which we can think about this is whether what we traditionally think of as more feminine features that we can nurture in politics. So there is a wealth or emerging literature in international relations which actually speak about how much we are focusing on. Just if you look at the vocabulary, dominance, actually there is a key article back from '87 by Carol Cohn, which is, I might not say the title exactly, but it's about sex and defense intellectuals. And she, as a woman, goes to American defense intellectuals who are actually calculating the probability of nuclear war. And then she analyzes the language in which they speak. And it's all about, she basically argues that it's a male fantasy of penetration and then the shapes and the whole language. So she goes in there, she's a complete outsider, and she looks at the most the biggest security issue, nuclear war, and then she sees a bunch of men who are talking about all kinds of very sexualized, scenarios and stuff. And so ever since, we know much more about how we need to see the language, the focus that is about survival, dominance, which is not only done by men, but they are traditionally connected to masculine character traits. And so when we ask, do we need to incorporate women? Maybe we can also broaden this question by asking, do we need to actually nurture certain traditionally female attitudes in politics? Do we need to legitimize them, give them more voice? And I think the answer is yes, certainly yes.
So I can say that there is a chapter in our handbook by Karin Augustam and Annika Bergman-Rosemont on the subject of gender and peaceful change. It's worth reading because they highlight many of these questions, especially by feminist scholars on peace and change. And it's a fascinating chapter, I thought. Let me just answer one question that was about what European Union or other international regional institutions do they play in this emerging great power rivalry. I think this is going to be very important. Do we want to see yet another Cold War, or do you want to see a different sort of competitive international politics, but cooperative too? There, the role of bridge builders, bridging powers, is very important. If everybody is joining one side or the other, you will end up in a bipolar Cold War situation. So, but then you don't play a big role because decisions are made in Washington or in Beijing. So this bridge builder idea is not new. The non-aligned movement, you may recall during the Cold War, tried to do that, the Bantung process. The neutral states of Europe sometimes try to play the Helsinki process, for instance. So there is great more opportunities here not to allow this new Cold War to become like the old one, because you still need Chinese market technology. You also need to make sure democracy is not sacrificed. So European Union is very much positioned in that sense. And the question is whether there is a good thinking going on in Europe to play their role. I don't know, maybe my colleagues sitting there know much better than I am.
The colleagues are not that sure about that either, given current circumstances. Is there anyone else who wants to add? Because then I would suggest we basically dealt now with three big concepts. So it's world order, peaceful change, and globalization. And perhaps I ask everyone to make a quick 2-minute or so closing statement, just wrapping up the evening in terms of how you saw it. And maybe we start, or TV, shall we start with you?
I don't have a whole lot to offer other than saying that the order is in transition, globalization is in progress. Nothing has come to an end point. This we have to realize, as it was discussed before, nothing is so linear either. You're going to get ups and downs, you're going to get pushbacks and pullbacks. But what you need is good leadership. And who will provide the leadership? It's not just political leadership, but intellectual leadership too. The European project was an intellectual project, no, wasn't it, originally? And we really need to collaborate, think about what sort of changes are feasible and how freedom as an essential part of that milieu should be there. I think the attractiveness of liberal order is it's one of the few systems that can offer freedom as well as prosperity. And the prosperity sometimes goes to the prosperity of a small segment of the society. And that's how we get into this class conflict. And class divisions are always there. And class divisions sometimes are submerged, pacified by welfare state or other measures. But the point is that class divisions will come out more openly if these divisions that you see in wealth distribution become larger and larger. So there is a whole host of issues as people in the post-war settlements thought about these issues, how to create order. Perhaps we are reaching that point. Of course, we didn't have a World War to stop or a Cold War to end at this point. But the point is, this order is changing much more rapidly, partly because of rise of China and the authoritarian model that it is propagating. And then the internal divisions we talked about in the liberal states. So we are in a kind of a transition period where endpoint is not clear at all. Of course, there will never be an endpoint, but the point is how we can achieve this transition without violence, without extraordinary militarization, without making all the mistakes that the previous round of great power rivalries and liberal conflicts caused. So I would urge that thinking is needed, and that thinking has to come from some source, and universities to political elite. But the point is, a lot more creativity is needed there, more than simple IR theorizing, let me put it that way. That's a weakness of our discipline. We are divorcing from public policy much sometimes, but it's time to think about our ideas should have a role in transforming the international order or world order as it is emerging.
Thank you, TV. And Erna, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, let me start with a conversation with a professor of mine who is actually teaching at CEU. And I remember we were discussing something about, she told me she's developing an IR curriculum, critical security studies on love. And I remember I was really taken aback by that statement. And then she saw my surprise, and then she asked me, Anna, what does IR teach us about, politics? And then we all know, what IR teaches about politics, that states are utility maximizers, they are self-interested, they will cooperate just up to the point, la, 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 la. And then she stopped me and asked me, so how do we get to peace from here, if this is the vision with which we look at the world, we look at ourselves. And so ever since, and spending time with the handbook and thinking about peaceful change, I think my main takeaway, and maybe something to share, is this idea of connectedness that goes much deeper than the concept of globalization. We are all connected to our families, to our history. We are all connected to the society, which has some recent or older memory of conflict. We are all part of institutions. And I think that it's very important that we realize how deeply we are connected to these processes, and to kind of live our lives and do our everyday practices when we think about international politics, but when we actually do that politics, to keep in mind that peaceful change is us and us together.
Thank you. Jozef, maybe I'm going to continue with you, because that seems to have been the order of things.
Okay, thanks. So 3 points on that. One would be, we always raise these very simple questions in the end, Markus. That's so the reality of today's world is that, depending on how you count, but there are only about 25% of states that still could be counted as liberal or seen as liberal democracies. Okay, so liberal democracy by far is not a dominant form of political organization around the world. Unfortunately, it's an embattled concept, and we are, I think, are in a situation where this needs to be defended. So, because it is obvious that the Kantian tripod that we have talked about several times and mentioned here several times is a great achievement of humankind, irrespective of where you would locate yourself in terms of your cultural affiliation. This is a great achievement of humankind since the Enlightenment. So should we, and how should we maintain this great achievement? That's that question. Now, I think we need to disentangle or look at two factors here, and those are the two other points that I was going to make. And one factor is we need to think, how do we make sure that we maintain the liberal international order, which is not necessarily Western-centric order, right? So we should disentangle, disattach this attachment of Western means liberal, because that definitely is not the case, and we should certainly try and build an order which is liberal, maintain it liberal, doesn't necessarily need to be Western-centric. And then the third point is structural, because the challenge, and we talked about it again, is the role of the state upon which the liberal international order hinges. The state is the political structure. It's the dominant form of political organization since the 30 Years' War and later. And that has been undermined as such in the current developments with globalization, with various kinds of non-state actors having influence, undermining the role of the state. Unless we can get the state back on its feet, it's going to be difficult. And or the alternative would be to develop liberal principles and norms for a new heteronomy, right? That's the John Ruggie, for those of you who read John Ruggie's work on, state sovereignty and territoriality, the new heteronomy in the order where you have structurally different actors interacting in the same order. How do you ensure that this kind of an order remains liberal? So then, kind of a neo-medieval situation with liberal principles. How do we make sure that this happens, right? That's the challenge. That's for you, the challenge to think about.
Jozef, thanks a lot. Dorit?
Yes, thank you. I think this is the moment that I'll out myself as a political sociologist and not an international relations scholar, which means that when I think of where we're going, I certainly don't start at the level of the international order. I don't even start at the level of states. I start down below. So I can't but answer otherwise. In terms of trying to get a feel of where we are now and where we're going, I also have to think about the recomposition of social class, which was something that also TV mentioned. But I'll be brief but more specific. I think what we're seeing globally is the recomposition of social classes, and I believe a very formative development is the rise of the new middle class globally. And the new middle class as a social class that has benefited from globalization economically. These are economic benefactors of globalization, if we think of it as a global system, who are very attached to certain patterns of consumption that might appear cosmopolitan or liberal. But what's interesting about the new middle class in post-socialist Europe, in Southeast Europe, Russia, Turkey, I mean, I think there are many countries in which one can find this, is that it doesn't correlate with support for liberal values, for the liberal values that the liberal international order was supposed to bring along with marketization. So I think, I mean, to put it in a slightly over dramatic fashion, the future hinges a lot on that particular social class. So I don't know in which direction that's going, but I think this correlation that was presumed to go hand in hand with economic liberalization and values liberalization has been decoupled and this decoupling is socially is embedded in a very prominent social class to which political elites are answering and whose political systems are very much trying to answer the needs of this very prominent and increasingly important social class. So whichever way we're going, which I'm not sure exactly where we're going, I think these are the key actors. I would watch the social class to get a feel for the future.
And Dorit, thanks a lot. So we basically got a view from below and from above, right? And I think that mirrors quite nicely, I mean, what's happening in the special issue and what's happening in the handbook. So for those of you who are actually present here, physically present, I put quite a few copies out there. So if you haven't gotten one, you may still be lucky to get one. So they're there for free, thanks to Chatham House, which is actually very, very kind that they gave it to us. On the handbook, unfortunately, I can't offer it to you for free. But if you're interested, buy it or get it at the library. It really is that's definitely going to be I think a seminal contribution to studying peaceful change. It's the very first handbook of its kind on the topic. So then thanks a lot to all of you here, to everyone who joined us via the Facebook stream. And again, the big privilege of those who are here, we're going to have a little reception afterwards, and then we can continue the conversation. And feel free to approach all the panelists. One panelist, unfortunately, you cannot approach. So TV, unfortunately, can't be with us. But TV, you're going to be back in May, I think.
Yes.
And I'm already greatly looking forward to that.
I will have a double drink with you and the Viennese colleagues sitting there. I don't think I'll go to Geneva this time, but maybe in the future.
That's great. So then TV, thanks a lot for joining us. And
terrific discussion, I must say. Fantastic.
Yes, I really enjoyed it too. Thanks a lot to the panelists, and thanks a lot for you for asking great questions. Thanks.